What that effectively means is that the generals of Alexander who've accompanied him on this campaign are going to take the regions that he controls, Greece, Macedon, and the Persian Empire, and divide them into chunks and then fight over them for, well, decades, arguably centuries, but decades. They're going to slide it up into various pieces and then dicker over who gets what piece. The various regions, I mean, you can divide it, kind of roughly into, I suppose you could say, three major chunks and then some smaller ones as well. Ptolemy, the greatest of his generals, is going to claim Egypt. And there's a reason Ptolemy claims Egypt. It's because it is the richest prize. Egypt still has all the advantages that it had when we talked about Egypt as its own kingdom. We talked about the pharaonic Egypt. And so taking over Egypt it's seen as the very best thing to have. It's defensible, it's incredibly productive land that's producing all this grain and riches. And so Ptolemy wants it. That's what he wants the most. So he's going to claim Egypt for himself. As you can see where the blue is another general named Antigonus the One-Eyed, and he's going to claim Macedon and Greece. And he doesn't effectively control all of Greece, but he's going to claim all of that territory, and he's going to seize control of it with his son Demetrius the Besieger. These are great names for goldfish, if nothing else. And then much of the rest of Persia is claimed by Seleucus. And Seleucus is going to go through a process where he claims big swaths of the Persian Empire, but he's going to find it challenging to hold on to all of it at once. And so over the years, some of this is going to kind of drift away and break up and fragment into smaller and smaller pieces. But each of these kingdoms that are established have a bunch in common. The generals of Alexander established very similar styles of government, where they're going to fuse the religion and the politics and the social culture of the local people they encounter with Greek religion and politics and social culture. They're going to center their administration around cities. They're going to import Greek speakers to actually run the business of their government. They're going to encourage anybody who wants to have a say in, influence over, pull with the government to learn to speak Greek. This has a couple of advantages, or at least a couple of consequences. The first is that if you already speak Greek because you're from Greece somewhere, there's a lot of cities in these various parts of the Persian Empire that now belong to Alexander's generals that are looking for workers, that are looking for administrators. There's a lot of plush white-collar jobs out there. If you speak Greek, you can write your own check at this point. You can just pick up, move anywhere inside the Persian Empire and get yourself a job. And a lot of Greek speakers are going to do this. The other advantage, or the other consequence of this use of Greek as the language of government, is that it encourages people who already live in the Persian Empire but don't already speak Greek to learn Greek. And in fact, they're going to develop a version of Greek known as Koine. That is kind of simplified, grammatically speaking. That's kind of like a trade Greek, so that if Greek is your second language, you can learn this sort of simpler version of Greek and get by. And so many people learn it, and Greek is spoken over such a huge swath of territory as a result of these conquests. By the time you get a generation or two in, Greek is everywhere. And while that's itself kind of a neutral consequence, it does make it possible for greater communication between all of these regions. So that if you were, say, a mathematician and you lived in Parthia, very well you might, you could easily write a letter to a scholar working in Pergamum, or you could easily pick up and travel to Egypt and go to the court of Ptolemy at Alexandria and get a job, because everybody is working and speaking in Greek, which means they can communicate much more readily than they ever could before. That makes it more possible for scholarship and literature and history and every other sort of thing you might use communication for, trade, communication, political connections, to flourish in ways that they had not. So Koine is enormously influential and important in creating a common, I guess, cultural pathway for people to move from one region to another. In addition to that, each of these new kingdoms, these are referred to collectively as the Hellenistic kingdoms. Hellenic means Greek. Hellenistic means like Greek, Greek-like, Greek-ish, if you will. And in these Greekish kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms, almost all of them, and almost all corners of them, are going to practice something called syncretism. That's when the ruler, doesn't have to be the ruler, I guess, but in this case it is. That's when the ruler, these new kings that are from Alexander's empire and Alexander's armies, are going to try to fuse elements of largely Greek religion with whatever the locals practice. This is something we saw weeks and weeks ago when we talked about Mesopotamian kings and creating kind of dual temples. You see the same thing emerge in these Hellenistic kingdoms. Greek gods will be fused together with local gods. Kind of the elements of each will be smooshed into one statue, one temple, a single new temple built or temples rededicated, in order to foster the idea that the peoples of Alexander's empire all have something in common, that the locals and the generals and the army that has come to invade, that they in fact worship the same gods in the slightly different guise, that in fact they have a lot in common, and that there's nothing really to worry about losing by sort of bowing to the ways of the new conqueror. So, you see examples of this preserved in art, statuary, architecture, murals, all kinds of things. And you can see some examples here just on this page. That first statue is a statue to Zeus Ammon. You can see the ram's horns indicating the divine nature of the person in the picture. And this is from Egypt, where the cult of Amun-Ra and the cult of Zeus were smooshed together in a single joint temple made, with the idea that there's just kind of one god that embodies both of those aspects. You see the same thing on these two images to the right. And here it's more of an artistic, noticeable thing, because the deity, the deity itself that's depicted here is not necessarily a fusion deity, but the style is a fusion style. On the right, it's a little less noticeable. That one's more of a classic depiction. But on the left, you can really see this in this sculpture. The style of the sculpture itself is noticeably Greek. This was probably something that was actually created by a Greek artist. The posture of the figure that's standing there, the drapery of the cloth itself, the outfit is a Greek outfit, and the style of the statuary and the depiction there is totally classical Greek. But the subject matter is the Buddha. So you can see syncretism takes a couple of different forms. Sometimes you see elements of two religions smooshed together very obviously. And in some cases what you see is just the kind of veneer of Greekification put over the local deities. And that's what you see more with these depictions of the Buddha. Okay. So that's one of the steps that you find consistently across the Hellenistic world. In addition to that, there is a great deal of effort in all the Hellenistic kingdoms to try to provide that carrot, the incentive to make local populations feel that it's worth investing in, it's worth supporting these new rulers. One of the ways they do that is by literally investing in the infrastructure of the communities that they have taken over. And nowhere do you see this more markedly than in Egypt. Ptolemy takes over the richest slice of the Persian Empire, the richest kingdom in the world, and he's going to take the wealth that he easily gathers from Egypt by collecting taxes, and he's going to turn it into a lot of publicly funded wonders, publicly funded stuff. Some of them are really visually obvious, like the Pharos of Alexandria. Alexandria is the sort of capital city. It's named after Alexander. It's renamed after Alexander, I should say. There's a lot of cities in the Hellenistic world named after Alexander. There's a lot named after Philip. There's a few named after Alexander's horse, in fact, Bucephalus. But in this case, we're talking about Alexander in Egypt, and one of the building projects that Ptolemy the First who is Alexander's general, invests in is building this lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria. Now, building projects are always, always popular in the ancient world and the modern world, because what it means is that you take the wealth that's gathered by the government, by the king in this case, and you literally put it right back into the local community. You're paying people to make the supplies, you're paying people to haul them, you're paying people to construct them, you're paying people to design the thing, you're paying people to do every step of this construction. And so it gives people jobs, and in the end, you create something that everybody can look at and goggle at and think, wow, look at what we've accomplished. And that's what this was designed to do. The Pharos is a lighthouse, as it sounds like. So it's built kind of on a spit out into the harbor to guide ships if the light is poor. And the way it's designed, so it's a big tall tower, very tall by ancient world standards. It's a big tall tower that you can climb up inside of. And at the very top, there is a system of mirrors where a fire can be lit, and the light from that fire will be magnified and concentrated by the mirrors so that it can be seen for miles in the dark. And so it's this great sort of beacon as to where the harbor is. Every ship that comes in and out is going to see this and goggle at it and be like, wow, what a cool thing that Ptolemy is able to build. In addition to that, some things that are a little less spectacular, and the Pharos is not the only thing that's going to be built on a monumental scale. There's going to be a bunch of stuff. But on a less spectacular scale, people like Ptolemy are going to be investing in really anything that he can point to and show off and say, haha, look at what my government is accomplishing. Look at what I, as a ruler, am paying for. I'm giving incentives to people to invent cool and new things. I'm giving incentives to people to make advances in science. I'm giving incentives to people to create new and fantastic forms of art. I'm paying for all of this, and all of us as a culture can glory in what we've accomplished. And so one of the things that Ptolemy creates really through his patronage, by being able to pay people to invent stuff and to develop things, are various, I guess you could say, scientific or technological advancements. Some of them are quite famous, like this one here, Ctesippus's water clock. Now, the point of this water clock, at this point in the world, there's no such thing as a clock in the way that we think of it. There's nothing that works mechanically to mark off time in the way that we would do it now. Instead, time is marked by sundials largely. And then if you wanted to time something, like you wanted it to be 2 minutes, it wouldn't necessarily be marked out as 2 minutes, but if you wanted it to be a certain amount of time, what people did was that they would fill up a big jug of water with a spigot, and then they would empty that jug of water, and when the jug of water was empty, you knew the time was up. That's how they timed how much time got to speak in the assembly in Athens, for instance. And because of this principle, people understood that, the controlled release of water happens at a certain rate, and so that you could time things using that. And so water clocks were built. The problem with water clocks as timepieces, I'm not going to get into too much of the detail of this, but the problem with them is that barometric pressure could very subtly affect how fast or how slowly they ran. Not enough that most people would ever know or care, but they did. What Ctesippus's water clock was designed to do was to create a very flashy, it's very cool and complicated, a very flashy system by which the pressure changes could be neutralized, so that no matter what happens with the barometric pressure, the water clock always runs at a constant rate. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why does this matter? Who wants this? And given the total absence of other kinds of timekeeping, who needs time to time things with this kind of precision? The answer, not to be too facetious, is no one. Nobody needs this. It's something done to demonstrate a scientific and mathematical principle. It's something done to demonstrate an understanding of basically mechanics and the fluid mechanics at that. And it ends up being used as a curiosity, as something to show off to people who come and visit the royal court. They're given out as gifts to various other rulers elsewhere to show how cool and smart and powerful Ptolemy is. It's a little bit of it's a bragging rights kind of a piece. Along similar lines, you see things like Hero's Aeolipile. This piece, that's one on the left, that's that strange, like, coppery looking thing. There's a copper kettle. This would be put over a fire. And then the water inside it, there would be water inside it. The water inside it would heat, and then the steam would rise through the pipe. You can see there's pipes there, into that thing in the middle. And you can see how there's like spigots on two sides there opposite each other. What happens is that the steams would rise into there, and then because of the way they were vented, it would make that spigoty thing whip around really fast. It's a rotor, and it just spins really fast as a result of the steam power. What this is, in essence, what you're looking at right there, from 300 BC, or 3rd century BC anyway, it's probably 240 or so. What you're looking at right there is the basic principle of the steam engine. It was well developed and well understood in Hellenistic Greece. And yet, what did they do with this piece of technology? Nothing. Same thing went with some of Ctesippus's other inventions. As you can see down there, a lot of what Ctesippus is going to invest in is creating things like automata, which are like little mechanical, I mean, you wouldn't really quite call them robots, but they're little like mechanical devices that like do stuff, like you wind it up or you pour in some water and it kind of plays out by itself. And they use various really quite complicated hydraulic engineering. So in that thing that you're looking at on the bottom there, it's this strange piece where what happens is that the man with the club hits the dragony thing, which waves its wings and opens its mouth, and it just kind of, you wind these things up and they do their thing. And what they are really is toys. They involve complicated mechanical principles, scientific principles, innovation, and yet what they do is primarily entertain and amaze people who have come to visit the court. Now, there are some exceptions, like the pump that you can see there. Ctesippus is working in Egypt, and moving water from one place to another is very important in a society that uses irrigation so heavily. And what he does is he invents a pump to move water basically upward so that you can move it against the flow of gravity. And this is, of course, very useful, and it is used in Egypt. But most of what's invented in these Hellenistic courts and paid for and shown off and built are really done just to show off. And part of the reason for that, it doesn't seem logical if you think about it, but there is some logic to it. There's a legend, a story that goes along with this. And the legend goes like this. A very brilliant inventor shows up to the court of Ptolemy one day and says, I've invented this device that does the work of 100 men. It splits logs or something, who knows what it does. But I've done this invention that does the work of 100 men. And the king's like, wow, that's great. I'll demonstrate it. And so the guy demonstrates it, and he's like, that's fantastic. And he's like, and have you built more than one of these? And the guy's like, no, this is a prototype. He's like, excellent. And you have the plans? And the guy's like, oh, sure. And so the king's like, okay, great. I'll reward you very heavily. Just give me the prototype and the plans, and then go off and do whatever it is you want with your reward. So he gives the guy a big bag of gold, and he takes collection of the item and its plans, and the man turns, and he's so pleased with himself, and he's leaving the palace. And before he gets out the door, he hears the king turn to his advisors and say, destroy it. And he turns around and he's like, what? Why would you destroy my beautiful invention? Why would you do that? You said it was great. And Ptolemy says, it is great. Don't feel bad. I'm really proud. If you ever invent anything else, come back. It's just that if I implement this thing, if I build it and use it, what am I going to do with 100 men? That's the thought process. This is Hellenistic kings are paying for this kind of development, not because they're looking for a way to turn the most profit off of their people. They're looking for a way to invest literally directly in providing scholars and thinkers and scientists and laborers, all of them at the same time, with as much financial security as they can. They don't want to create something that is going to cut into what is provided by hand labor, because they want those laborers to have jobs. Meanwhile, however, all of the greatest mathematicians and scientists and metallurgists and scholars of every type are flocking to Egypt. At least in part, because Ptolemy is going to invest very heavily in giving them jobs. So they're all going to come a-running. He's going to create something known as the Museum of Alexandria. A museum is a temple to the muses. And of course, the muses involve all kinds of things: poetry, music, history. All of them have muses. And at this temple to the muses in Alexandria, it's this big complex that Ptolemy is going to pay to have built. It's going to house something that ends up becoming one of the wonders of the ancient world, the library. The Library of Alexandria was an attempt to house a copy of every book ever written. Now, they don't do that, but that was the goal. And to this end, Ptolemy is going to pay hundreds of people, dozens at a time, to work directly for the library. There are people in acquisitions that go out into the empire and into other parts of the empire that Alexander conquered, using that Koine, that Greek that everybody speaks, to try to find copies of literally everything they might not already have a copy of in the museum, and to gather everything up, bring it back to Alexandria, where it will be copied, translated, commented upon by a whole crew, a whole staff of scholars whose job it is to do this. And so for that reason, he's going to employ a whole bevy of mathematicians. He's going to employ a whole bevy of philosophers. He's going to employ historians. He's going to employ people who compile poetry. He's going to employ all of these people. And then anybody anywhere in the world, at least in the Mediterranean world and eastward, who wants to study any particular topic, where they go is Alexandria, because it makes it famous as a repository for all of this knowledge and a repository for all of the people who know the most about any given subject. And so what Ptolemy does is he creates Egypt as this destination for the cutting edge of all scholarship. And so in that way, he enhances the prestige of his kingdom, and he also creates this kind of bustling trade. It may not be the biggest trade in the world, in terms of sheer profitability, but it does establish this flow of people and ideas into his kingdom. There's also a big shift that you can sort of trace to the Hellenistic period in artistic styles. Classical Greek statuary followed a series of kind of rules, aesthetic rules, that were favored by the Greek city-states and the people who ruled them and who paid for these statues. How art looks really revolves around what the people who pay for art want to see. This is one of those chicken and an egg kind of things. But very much when you see a massive change in artistic styles, usually what that reflects is that there's a change in goal. There's something that the people paying for art want to do differently. And you can see that play out here in Hellenistic art versus Hellenic or classical Greek art. The classical Greek example you can see to the left there, this is a discus thrower. Now, it's a good example of a classical style. You can see that there's a figure of a man. He's just a generic man. He's not any particular man. It's a figure of a man, and his body is realistic in the sense that it's in the proportions of a human being. It's very idealized, however. So it's like a real but perfected. So all of the imperfections, all of the asymmetry that you might find in a real person are all smoothed out. Facial features are quite generic, and the face is always in classical Greek statues depicted very serene. Earlier archaic statues often had a dumb, weird smile. It's called the archaic grin. It's odd. I might show you a picture later. But at any rate, you see the face. The face is always in repose. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a person actually throw a discus, but their face does not look like that. Take my word for it. They're usually making some kind of an ugly, horrifying face of effort. But this guy, he's about to whip a discus, but he looks like he's taking a nap. The goal of this classical Greek art is to show the human body in this very idealized, perfected, and completely emotionally controlled way. That was the goal. And it's something that in Athens was highly promoted. They're the kind of center of the creation of this. They're not the only place that do it, but the center of the creation of this kind of classical art. And the goal, of course, emphasizes what elite Athenians want to emphasize that the best kind of person to depict is somebody who is in control of their emotions, because a person who is too irrational, a person who is too worked up, is a person who makes poor political decisions. And in a democracy, you can't have that. So everybody has to be serene, everyone has to be self-controlled, everyone has to have a lot of dignity about themselves. Then on the right, what you see is this new Hellenistic style. This is a picture of Laocoon. He is one of the people, I'm not sure if he's in the Odyssey or the Iliad, but he takes part in the Trojan War. And he angers the god of the sea, and he and his sons are going to be punished as a result. And they're going to be grabbed up by sea serpents and bitten. And so it's a really unpleasant, horrifying way to die. And the statue of Laocoon, you can see some of the same kinds of elements. You have this beautiful figural modeling where you have this very perfected physical body that's being depicted. But where you see the dissimilarity is in the expressiveness, the emotion. Laocoon does not look serene. Earlier classical Greek sculptures, if they were going to depict the same subject, would show him looking oddly blank. They would show him look without a lot of emotion on his face. They wouldn't show him in this very expressive physical posture either. So this is very much a new thing. And you get these statues that have some of the same elements, this real mastery of depiction when it comes to bodies in particular. But at the same time, you see a new emotionality, a new sort of physical expressiveness of feeling. And in part, this springs up because the leaders of Hellenistic kingdoms, people like Ptolemy, wanted to make sculptures that would show off Greek skill at making sculptures of beautiful bodies. But at the same time, they also wanted to tell stories that would be understandable to people who were not Greek. They didn't grow up in Greece, didn't already know these things by heart. They wanted to be clear what was happening. And so instead of simply always showing what looked like one generic blank person after another, and then you would know who they were because the statue would be labeled. Instead, there's this effort to depict these very dramatic scenes, to be moving in a way that will resonate with people no matter what their culture is and no matter what their language is. Okay, so along with that, we also have some changes in philosophy. There's also going to be several new schools of philosophy that become popular during this time period, after the death of Alexander, when these new kingdoms are set up. And a lot of these philosophies, all three of the ones I'm about to talk about briefly, really center around a central problem, a challenge. Especially in the Greek-speaking world, where you had Plato and Aristotle, and before him Socrates, before either of them, taking on the ideas about how you should live the best life. What is the best kind of political structure? What is the best kind of attitude to have toward things like science? And what is the best attitude toward morality, that kind of thing? In places where those had been common questions that were being asked, there's this new issue that arises, especially in Athens, where so much of their identity centered around democracy, the idea that they were free to make their own choices and live their own lives in the way that they determined was best. Well, now they don't have democracy. Instead, they have a king. Antigonus the One-Eyed, and after that Demetrius the Besieger, are now the Hellenistic kings of that region. Before them, there was Alexander. Before Alexander, there was Philip. And so there are a lot of people in the Greek city-states, Athens and others, where they've been accustomed to calling their own shots, now asking themselves, how can I be a good person if I no longer have freedom to choose? How can I still think of myself as a good person if I no longer have the right to make political choices? And Hellenistic philosophies are going to rise up in part to try to address that issue. So I'm going to briefly go over kind of the three big ones, just that you should be aware of. Okay, so the first, and this guy was a contemporary of Alexander the Great, Diogenes the Cynic. The word cynic makes its way into English. It means dog, and he gets that reputation because he advocates and will stage these kind of stunts in Sinope, where he lives. It's up by the Black Sea. He stages these stunts where he shows how little he cares about what polite convention would have him do. He doesn't care about what society expects him to do or how society expects him to behave. Diogenes has a major problem with that expectation, in fact. He points out the moral downfalls of simply doing what people think you ought to do without really thinking about it. And he will make this point in, you could argue, quite a grotesque way by pointing out the difference between somebody who everybody admires and thinks is a good person and invites to all the best parties, a merchant, for example, who makes his living by creating the best possible deal for himself, even if it means that poor people suffer, even if it means that other people are literally harmed by his actions. And yet everybody thinks of this person as a good person. Meanwhile, a person who is simply poor but totally blameless is sneered at and looked down on. He gives an example of bodily functions. Poop, for example. Everybody poops. Diogenes will say it's necessary for health. Absolutely, it's totally unavoidable. Everybody does it. And if you were to ask somebody, is it evil? Is it a bad thing to do? They would say, of course not. That's ridiculous. And yet, he says, we're all ashamed of it. We all do it behind closed doors. We all hide the fact. We pretend that we don't even talk about it. And we're ashamed of something like that, which is completely healthy and natural. And yet, we don't think anything of behavior that is quite immoral, like that merchant who's taking advantage of people. So he would make this point by shocking people, like doing things like pooping in the street. That's where his followers get the nickname cynic, meaning dog. You can see because they poop in the street. At any rate, Diogenes goes on to say, look, people have just bought into this whole scheme without thinking about it. Everybody tells you got to live a certain way so that you can get a job and work for the man who can then make you money so that you can buy a house and live a certain kind of lifestyle, and that's the only way to be happy. And he's like, that's ridiculous. Look at me. And he just lives on the street and he eats what people happen to give him. Now, he is a relatively popular philosophy teacher, so people are giving him a fair amount of good handouts. But he lives on what people give him. He very famously and ostentatiously lives in a jar for some time, this big clay jar that he makes his home in. And he's like, I'm completely comfortable, and all you jerks are working for the man. Look at you, haha. If you were to boil Diogenes the Cynic's ideology down into a sentence, it would be life stinks. Don't play along with it. Think hard about what you're actually doing. Now, there's a legend that he actually met Alexander at one point, and this sums up Diogenes' whole deal. This story. Diogenes was one day giving a little talk to people, and Alexander, who was passing through town at the time, stops by, and because he was very interested in philosophy, figures he's going to see this Diogenes character. And so he stops and he listens, and Diogenes is giving his talk to his followers, and Alexander was deeply moved. He's like, wow, that's a really interesting philosophical outlook. So he goes up to Diogenes afterwards, and he says, hi, I heard your philosophy talk, and I think you're really cool, and I wonder if there's anything I can do for you. Now, Alexander is standing there at the head of this huge army. He is arguably the most powerful person in the world. When he says, what is that I can do for you, he can do almost anything for Diogenes. He can give him a permanent job. He can build him a palace to live in. He can create a school of philosophy that he could then be in charge of. He can do a lot for Diogenes. Diogenes looks up at him and says, you want to know what you can do for me? And Alexander says, yes, I would really like that. And Diogenes says, could you move a little to your left? You're standing in my sun. That's it. So Diogenes encapsulates, if you had to point to why he was so popular, why people were interested in him. Now, he doesn't have tons and tons and tons of followers, but people are interested in Diogenes. Why? It really comes down to the hope that he gives people that all the stuff they thought was so important, maybe it doesn't really matter in the way that they thought it did, that you can still be your own person no matter what your circumstances are. Then you have Epicurus. Now, Epicure Epicurean is a word that makes its way into English as well. And today, it means a gourmet, somebody who understands the finer things in life, which is a little ironic because Epicurus himself doesn't really advocate for that. What he suggests instead is that life is what it is. There's always going to be some suffering, there's always going to be tragedy. And in the end, when you die, your being dissolves into something he calls atoms. And you just kind of cease to exist. That's it. And so this life is all you really get. What you should do is make the best of it. Make it as pleasant as you can. And the way to achieve that is to strive for simplicity, to strive for peace and harmony as much as you possibly can. Love your family, keep your friends close, and enjoy simple pleasures. Stay out of it as much as possible when it comes to kind of really upsetting activities like politics. Instead, he's like, content yourself in finding pleasure in simplicity. And think about ways to make sure that you can guarantee that for your whole life. So, for instance, if you always have a salad and a piece of bread for lunch, you always have this simple lunch. That's good because now you don't feel hungry anymore and you had your lunch and it's nice and healthy. But think about how happy you'll be if once in a while you also have a piece of cheese. Think how much pleasure that treat will give you. And it only gives you this kind of pleasure because you're sparing with it, because you're not indulging yourself all the time. Instead, you kind of save things up, accustom yourself to simplicity so that when you have a treat, when you have a piece of joy, you'll really enjoy it. And the same thing goes for when sadness happens to you. Try to accept it. Try to simply roll with it as much as you can, so that when sad things happen to you, you can kind of moderate that by understanding that it's not that great a collapse from where you were before because you're accustomed to simplicity. Your needs are fairly simple, so that you can not put yourself in a position where your whole life is destroyed by some turn of fate. Instead, kind of create for yourself as much peace and as harmony and minding your own business as you possibly can. So that's the deal with Epicurus. And kind of, you might see, if you think about it hard, a sort of a parallel with Diogenes. Diogenes argues that you really don't have to play along, that things may be rough, things may be unfair. You don't have to simply accept that, though. And Epicurus, even though he's far less of a radical and therefore far more socially acceptable than Diogenes, is putting forward the same basic idea that, life is what it is. You don't have to get worried about that. You don't have to get upset by it. Mind your own business, tend your own garden, try to find your pleasures where you can. That's what Epicurus advocates as a way to cope with this new political and social situation. Which brings us to the third and final school of philosophy. This one by far is going to be the most popular. And it's founded by a guy named Zeno the Stoic. Stoicism and Stoic philosophy is a word in English that retains the closest meaning to what it meant in the ancient world. It now means somebody who is able to tolerate and endure suffering. Somebody is able to put up with things without showing a lot of reaction or emotion about it. And that's closely linked to what the school of Stoicism kind of meant for people who followed it in the ancient world. What Zeno puts forward, his idea, if you boiled it down to its essence, is that we don't control what happens to us in life. Things happen. Suffering comes to us all, sooner or later. We don't control what happens, but we do control ourselves. We control how we react to what happens. And so what we should always strive for is to make sure that we are always choosing to do what is right, what is consistent with our moral beliefs. So no matter what the consequences might be, we dedicate ourselves to doing what we believe to be the right thing. We don't let emotion, fear, anger, selfishness sway us off that path. Instead, no matter what the consequences might be, we stick to our beliefs. We stick to what we believe to be ethically right. And if we do that, then nobody in the world can truly control us. That's how it goes. So let's imagine we lived under a king, an evil tyrant. and the evil tyrant were to say to you, I'd like you to kill your neighbor because he's ugly and he looked at me funny, and I don't like that, and I'm the king and I have this power, so I'm going to tell you to do it. You have a choice now. It may feel like you don't have a choice because the king can do terrible things to you if you disobey. But the reality, the real fact is that you do have a choice. You can obey or not. And if you obey, what you've done is that you have given up your moral beliefs. You have given up what you believe to be right in order to act on your fear that the king will hurt you. What Zeno would say is that no matter what it costs you, you can't do that. You have to look the king in the face and say, no, it's wrong and I won't do it. Even if it means that you are tortured, even if it means if you are executed, even if it means that you suffer, you cannot allow yourself to be turned off of the path of what you believe to be right. And if you are able to do this, if you are able to look at the king and say, no, I won't do it, then sure, maybe bad things will happen to you. Maybe you will physically suffer, but your soul, your spirit will not be broken, will not be compromised. In the end, the king can't make you. The reality is that as long as you understand that you are the only person that controls yourself, you will never have a master. It doesn't matter what political system you live under, whether you have a king or a democracy. The fact is, you are the only one who controls yourself. You can never be a slave, not really. So, this kind of philosophy, you can probably imagine why that resonated with people, why it was immensely comforting to those who suddenly have to deal with a different political system where they have much less power than they once did, to understand and embrace the idea that it may be hard, but they still haven't lost what makes them a good person, what makes them a better person in their mind, according to Herodotus, than, say, Persians who lived under a tyrant. That's what they told themselves in that 300 passage, is that Persians are destined to lose because they're inherently weaker. They lived under a king and submitted to that kind of political authority. That meant that they weren't as tough, as strong, as moral as people who lived under a democracy. So Zeno comes along with a way to salvage people's vision of themselves in Greece in particular and in Athens. And that vision needed a lot of salvaging because the political situation had so radically altered. This is just a quick image of the Colossus of Rhodes. It's usually imagined as this picture that I've kind of cut off with the text box on the left there, as the statue that straddled the harbor at Rhodes, but in fact that's not it's not physically possible. In fact, it was kind of much more like the Statue of Liberty. It was built out kind of on a spit, and there was a big statue with a thing on top. At any rate, it was built in 226 BC by leftover scrap metal because Demetrius the Besieger had attacked the city and then retreated in a rush. And when you retreat in a rush, you leave your armor behind because it's too heavy to run in. And so there was all this extra scrap bronze lying around, and they built a 200-foot statue out of it. It was quite something. But aside from this setback at Rhodes, Demetrius the Besieger had had such success in Athens, and they were having such success in pacifying this region of Greece, that when he passed through Athens, not only did the Athenian assembly allow this king to stay there. This is the same people who once executed messengers for having bowed to the king of Persia. The same people who executed naval admirals for abandoning a couple of crews of ships in order to win a battle. Not only did they allow Demetrius to enter the city and be heralded as their noble and true king, they allowed him to stay, to put up his temporary residence in the Parthenon, in the temple to the gods. They not only hailed him as a king, they hailed him as a god. Unthinkable. That's how bad it had gotten. That's how far people had fallen. That's how beat down the Greek city-states were at this point. So that's where we're going to break off today. The Hellenistic world is this new patchwork where many of the kingdoms are united by cultural elements. They're not necessarily all friendly with each other all the time, but it's this new political reality that leaves a little bit of an opening. There's going to be a new sort of power vacuum and a new powerful, I guess, force that is going to start rising in the West. And we'll talk about that next time. Yay! So long, everybody.